Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 2021 Colin Roderick Memorial Lecture with our special guest, Tony Birch. My name is Paul Hardesty. I'm the chairman of the Foundation for Australian Literary Studies, and I'll be your MC for this evening. Before we get going, first, welcome everybody who's joining us online around the country, and for those of you joining us at JCU in person, thanks for attending our second virtual lecture. Actually, this year it's hybrid. Last year everything was done virtually, but this year we're starting to get a little bit more flexible, and we've got a great group joining at the Plaza at James Cook University live, and of course, thanks for joining us around the country. I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of Australia as the first inhabitants of this country, and pay our respects to the traditional owners of the land on which some of us today are standing, the Bindal and Wilgarukaba people in Townsville, and of course to traditional owners of sea and land country across the nation, wherever we might be joining from today. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the valuable contribution that Australian Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people make to James Cook University and to the broader community. We have staff and students and members of FALS and supporters across the country. I'm joining you from Perth in Western Australia. Welcome to the lecture today. A couple of quick acknowledgements. I'd like to acknowledge the Chancellor of James Cook University, Bill Trudell, and the Vice Chancellor, Professor Sandra Harding. Also, I'd like to acknowledge the Life Governors of FALS, the Honorable Kieran Culane, Adjunct Professor Don Gallagher, and Adjunct Professor Stephen Torre. For those of you who don't know a lot about the Foundation, it's the importance of recognizing literary excellence across Australia that drove Colin Roderick to establish the Foundation more than 55 years ago. The Foundation for Australian Literary Studies, the logo behind me. With his wife, Margaret, the well-regarded writer, editor, academic, and educator, formed the organization in July of 1966 at the then University College of Townsville to promote and encourage Australian literature at the local and the national level. More than 55 years later, FALS continues to thrive, but it's the vision of Colin Roderick that has been integral and foundational to its continued success. He was educated at Bundaberg State School, and he graduated with a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Queensland's External Studies program in 1936, whilst working as a school teacher. He then went on to obtain a Bachelor of Education, and following a brief period in the Australian Army, a master's degree in both arts and education. Later, he earned a PhD in 1954 for his dissertation on the well-known Australian novelist Rosa Praed. In the post-war years, Roderick took up a position in Sydney as the publisher with Angus and Robertson, where he remained into the 1960s, eventually becoming editor-in-chief of the firm's educational division. During the 1950s, Roderick was also the convener and then honorary secretary of the Australian Literature Committee, and was instrumental in establishing a chair of Australian literature at the University of Sydney. After the death of Miles Franklin, the novelist, in 1954, he completed her project to set up the Miles Franklin Literary Award in 1957. In 1965, Roderick was appointed professor of English at what was to become James Cook University in Townsville. And he's remembered even today as an energetic teacher with a passion for promoting the study of Australian literature. Roderick's research and writing, including authoritative biographies of Mike Franklin, Banjo Patterson, and the explorer Ludwig Leichhardt, continued even after his retirement from JCU in 1976. Today, the Foundation, FALS, presents an annual lecture series and a prestigious book award, both of which have been named in the Rodericks, Colin and Margaret's honor. This evening, the Colin Roderick Memorial Lecture is to be presented by Tony Birch in conversation with James Cook University Senior Lecturer in English and Writing, Roger Osborne. So what I'd like to do now is quickly introduce Roger. And Roger is Senior Lecturer and Coordinator of English and Writing, Humanities, College of Arts, Society, and Education at James Cook University. And he is a founding board member of the Foundation, or sorry, a board member of the Foundation of Australian Literary Studies. So Roger, over to you to introduce Tony and to begin the discussion that we're all looking forward to.
Thanks very much, Paul. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the Irraganji people on whose land I live and work in Cairns. And I'd like to give my respects to elders past, present, and emerging in that place, and also give my respects to any elders who might be present in the audience here in Townsville and also watching us online. This has been a bit of a journey to get to this place where we are now, presenting this online and in a hybrid way. Originally, we had invited Tony to join us in person up here in far north Queensland, but as we're all experiencing, that has become quite difficult. But I'd like to thank the Tropical Writers Festival and acknowledge their work in persisting for as long as they did. And fingers crossed, and we hope that the Tropical Writers Festival will be able to invite writers up to the north again real soon. In supporting that event, in this event, I'd like to acknowledge the Copyright Agency, who is sponsoring this event, and also the Association for the Study of Australian Literature. FALS is contributing to the recognition and of writing of all sorts in Australia at the present time, and has recently partnered with ebooks to award the Viva la Novella Prize to a regional writer. And that was awarded just last week to Christine Balint for her novella Water Music. And alongside that, another award was presented to Helen Meany, Every Day is Gertie Day. And so there is a celebration of writing that FALS contributes to annually in these sorts of events, but throughout the year. This is adds to that the pleasure that we have in inviting Tony to present the lecture, but to do it in conversation. It's one of those things where you say Tony Birch needs no introduction, but I'm going to provide you with an introduction from one of the most recent publications. There's two of those that we might talk about during the conversation. Tony Birch is the author of 3 novels: the best-selling The White Girl. It's a winner of the 2020 New South Wales Premier Award for Indigenous Writing, and it was shortlisted for the 2020 Miles Franklin Literary Award. Ghost River, winner of the Victoria Premier's Literary Award for Indigenous Writing. And Blood, which was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Award in 2012. He's also the author of Shadowboxing and 3 other short story collections: Father's Day, The Promise, and Common People. His first collection of poetry, Broken Teeth, was published in 2016, and Whisper Songs is the most recent collection. In 2017, he was awarded the Patrick White Literary Award for his contribution to Australian literature. And that award is recognised as a body of work. And so from that biography, we see Tony as a significant a contributor to Australian literature as a writer. And our discussion tonight is going to be about reading and writing, the foundations for Tony's practice as a writer in his reading, but then also we'll be inviting discussion of the reading that we might do as readers of Tony Birch's work. And so that there is then the open invitation to anyone online to find their way down to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask questions, and there might be the ability to send questions to us from the ground there in Townsville. But I'm going to start with this conversation. Welcome, Tony Birch. Thank
you.
I'd like to say welcome to Townsville, but welcome to the Colin Roderick Lecture for 2021. Like to start, but it is a question of reading these ideas of foundational reading that we have, and I know that in interviews that you've mentioned various writers have inspired you and whose work you reread as a writer. Could you say something about your reading history and how that's helped to develop you as a writer over these many years that you've been working?
Yeah, and thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you everyone for attending either in person or online. It's a great privilege to be talking to you tonight. It is a pity that we're not in town full. I was very much looking forward to getting my shorts out. It was not to be. Look, I think the best way to start would be to say I'm a lifelong reader. I started reading quite voraciously from a very young age, so that I joined my first public library in Fitzroy, where I still live, when I was 5 years old. And from then until now, I would never not be reading, and I've read extensively over that time. And I would say that initially my reading gave me a great sense of emotional comfort and a great sense of what I later realized was intellectual and creative development. So that I grew up in a really poor house, and we certainly didn't have any books in the house. We wouldn't have been able to afford to buy books, but reading was something that I felt was both giving me comfort, but also it introduced me to places and to worlds that I have no sense of personally. It's important to say also that my first attempt at secondary schooling was quite appalling, in the sense that I dropped out of school very young. But when I decided to go back and do year 12 of a night, so I went to a TAFE college in my late 20s and did a year 12 of an evening. And what I found was that I was actually really well equipped to do humanities subjects, and consequently, when I started at Melbourne University as a first year mature age student in 1988, I realized that the fact that I had read so much and absorbed so much and thought about the world so much through writing, that I was really, I think, equipped to deal with really important philosophical and intellectual ideas. I then at university, I did some literature, but I actually did a PhD in history. And it's classic, when you're either a student, a PhD student, or when I was an academic teaching Aboriginal and Australian history in the history department at Melbourne University, I went away from fiction quite a bit because I was just too busy reading the stuff I had to read for my work. And what I found was that about 20 years ago now, I found that I was actually missing so much by not reading fiction and poetry. I made a deliberate decision to focus on these genres as a reader, and that led to me moving away from writing what we might call academic history to, again, getting into writing fiction and poetry very seriously. So I had published a fair bit of poetry in the 90s, but I'd never written any fiction. But when I went back as a reader to really good fiction around the year 2000, I then found that I was really at a time in my life when I wanted to write both short fiction and the novel. So I think that the best way to sum it up is that reading has been the staple of my life, again, emotionally, intellectually, and creatively. And sometimes, I've been asked a question a couple of times, if you could do one but not the other, what would you give up? I would give up writing before reading. Reading is something which is much more important to me than writing, and much more enjoyable. Writing is sometimes difficult. It can be annoying and frustrating, whereas I find reading just gives me really pure enjoyment. So it's a classic thing, Roger, of reading for life is, for me, an example of an education for life.
An education for life is a good way to put that. I've read in one of your interviews that Barry Hines' Kestrel for a Knave was a significant book for you. I'm going to say as a young man. I'm not sure exactly when you read it.
As a kid. So it's really good to talk about this book. So Kestrel for a Knave by Barry Hines. It was written in the mid-60s. Also, by the way, it was turned into a beautiful film called Kes by Ken Loach. We studied that book in what was called Form 2 or Year 8 at Richmond High School, which is a high school, or was a high school in inner Melbourne, set on the Birrarung or the Yarra River. And in fact, you could sit in your classroom and look out across the river down below, which was very frustrating because I always wanted to be on the river and not in the classroom. And it was remarkable because Kestrel for a Knave is set in a northern town of England. It's set in a very depressed town, although it's a coal mining town. Billy Casper, who is the protagonist in the novel, is a kid who was about my own age at the time. He gets beaten up by everyone in his life, from his mum to his older brother to kids in the schoolyard to really vicious teachers who thrive on corporal punishment. I certainly identified with that, coming from a household where my father was extremely violent, and our teachers were still able to give you quite severe strapping at school. I could handle myself in the schoolyard, but again, you're in a sort of atmosphere of violence, essentially. And yet this boy in the novel, Billy, finds great respite, great sanctuary in going to this sort of wild just outside of the town, where he discovers a kestrel, a bird, which he both befriends, but also realizes he can never tame. But it's about this love of nature, for want of a better word, and love of this bird. And the thing I think that's remarkable is that myself and even other kids, we had so much affinity with the character, not just because of the what you might call the working class nature of the book, but because of this other possibility, this other world. And yeah, realizing now that, looking out of that window and looking out at Aboriginal country, looking out at the Birrarung, or what people call the Yarra River, was a place that I loved and spent all my spare time in. And of course, I since have written a novel called Ghost River based on that experience. But it was both understanding the deprivation that this boy had to deal with, but also the beauty of being out in nature, being out in place. And although at the time, it's important to say, I could never articulate that. So I would never be able to have intellectually articulated. It was just such a beautiful feeling of love of country, of love of place. And just as not an aside, but a reference point, Roger, in 2015, I was involved in a global project called Weather Stations, where part of it was I got to teach really poor, impoverished kids living on the outskirts of Dublin. This was after the global financial crash, and these kids were really poor, as poor as any kids I've ever seen in my life. And we talked about places that they love. We're talking about love of place and its relationship to climate change. And these were pretty tough kids. And I said then, for the first time, what I wanted to articulate, I said, it's all right, it's okay to say I love this place. So when we're 12 and 13-year-old kids knocking around the river and smoking and carrying on, you never would have turned to your mate and said, I love this place, because you would have seen as that being a bit naff or something. But what I realize now that I loved in that novel is that it expressed a love of place in the same way that I love that environment around me.
Yeah, I think that's just hearing you talk about that experience of that book. I think anybody who's read your short stories, your novels that are set around the Birrarung will see the similarities. There's like an opportunity for all of us. That's a novel that's now on my list since talking to you. The Kestrel for a Knave. It seems to be one of those that has struck a chord with so many people. I guess we have those sort of moments in your reading history to thank for the impulses that have led you to articulate your place in and around where you've grown up. When we talk about reading and writing, and particularly with your the things that you've done in the last few decades, you have been a teacher of creative writing for quite some time as well. And I wondered if so you've presented to us the experience that you've had of being a reader and then being inspired or given the permission to articulate, to say that you love a place. So I was wondering if you would talk about your experience of teaching and how you might have encountered similar reluctance among students to read in the way that you had done during your lifetime.
Yeah, so I taught creative writing at Melbourne Uni from 2002 until 2015 in the creative writing program. I also have done what you might call community teaching. I was involved in a project which was delivering free sessions to homeless people in St Kilda for many years. I've done stuff with Koori kids, Aboriginal kids within the juvenile justice system in Victoria, kids in lockup, done other community stuff. And the reason I raised that point is that one of the things that I found interesting, I think that kids who are better educated, is that they were sometimes a bit hamstrung by their fear of emotion or their fear of expressing emotion. So that point about talking about a love of place. Whereas when you teach people who have got who've lived on the street, and this is not talking about, write about experiences, that these people, there's nothing they can hide. Their life is exposed. Kids in lockup, their life is exposed. So their expression, I think, is often a lot more transparent, a lot more open. And I found that to be an advantage. I mean, under obviously very terrible circumstances. I think that what I'd say in teaching for 13 years, and contrary to comments that you hear, like Melbourne University's first year creative writing course, when I ran it, we had over 500 students in the lecture theatre. We had the biggest lecture theatre. It seated 504 students, and I always used to dread if the numbers went over 500, I'd have to do a repeat lecture, which I didn't want to do. So we thankfully just kept it under 500. But people often, diss creative writing subjects, and they say, well, people don't read. I mean, my students had to read extensively, and every subject that I taught and that other creative writing teachers taught at my university, they were all reading primary material, fiction, poetry, novel excerpts every week, and reading critical theory as well. So they had a lot of work to do. I think the issue here, Roger, is that what I found is that students who really excelled, or maybe not excelled in that year. So I could think of a writer like Alice Bishop, a short story writer who I taught in my subject. I think her story collection called A Constant Hum. She wasn't the best student when I taught her in first year, and I think I've talked to Alice about this, but she was the student who loved reading, who loved books, who understood those writers that really spoke to her, that taught her, that kept her really involved with it. And I think that when I was teaching, particularly the short story subject, I knew the students who were going to do well because they were like a subcult who would pass around seminal short story collections. Dennis Johnson's Jesus' Son is a classic for this, where people would say, have you read this book? And they would pass it around. They loved the genre, they loved the subject matter. The students who tended not to stick with it are the students who I called careerists. They wanted to have a career as a writer, but they didn't really have the passion for reading and subsequently writing. So I found, Roger, that my students who really wanted to write, and those who stick with it for the long haul, and those in the end who can't not write, are the ones who do have that same sense of love of writing, love of literature. A supplementary issue, though, is I think that in a country like Australia, where there's, we still need to come to terms with this as being Aboriginal country. This is Aboriginal country right across this continent. And I think for some young people who are becoming aware of that, non-Aboriginal people, young students, it would be, well, where do I sit in this landscape, accepting that reality? So rather than try and carry on with that historical sense of amnesia of this is a settler country or this is a European country, very thoughtful young people realize, no, this is Aboriginal country. Then the next question, I think, or the next puzzle for them is, and where does my story sit in that landscape? And I think that's a really challenging process for young writers, but I think one that has to be nurtured and one that has to be worked through, because I think you want those people to come out of the other side of that with something valuable to say and something valuable to contribute, because you don't want to, the last thing I would want to do as a teacher, but also as an Aboriginal person, is to allow a situation where those people felt there wasn't a story they could write about. You want to share stories. I just want to say to your audience, that Arnie Joy Murphy, who's a remarkable Wurundjeri elder on the country that I'm talking on tonight, the first thing that Arnie Joy would do when she went to an event is ask people, whether they be settler Australians, white people, migrants, where do you come from? She'd ask them about their family, their story. She always wants to hear someone's story, rather than say, no, you've simply got to listen to my story. She always invites people to speak. And I think when you feel as an Aboriginal person a sort of sovereign calmness or a sovereign understanding of who you are, it gives you the security to invite people to share their story with you. And that's really important to me.
Yeah, thanks. It sort of suggests the importance of reading widely as well, particularly for non-Indigenous readers. There's so much work that's been published in the last decade or more of Indigenous writers. I wonder if in that that it's going to be one of those hard questions of writers who might be inspiring you from the Indigenous writing, not just in recent times, but in the past decades, that may have inspired you in the same way that your early reading has done.
Yeah, look, I think that not exclusively, but I think primarily I've been always been excited by Aboriginal poets, going back obviously to people like Udra Nunakal, who's so, she's like a foundation stone. So any of us that have had any opportunity for success in more recent times, we really we're only able to do that because of all the hard yards that someone like Udra Nunakal embarked on. I think Lionel Fogarty, I know Lionel quite well personally, but I've been to a Lionel Fogarty poetry reading, and I find his readings mesmerizing. I don't know of a writer who can hold an audience like Lionel can. He's just this incredible presence. He's passionate. He's open. He's a trickster. He's everything that you ever want in a room listening to a poet. And I think he, to me, is such a huge figure. And I think that I would continue that by saying, and I was talking to someone today, when we look at some of the younger generation of poets coming through, so Evelyn Araleuan's Drop Bear poems, I've interviewed Evelyn a couple of times on book. That's a phenomenal book of poems. A new poet that I've endorsed recently, her collection, Jazz Money, who's just got a new collection out for UQP. They're really continuing and developing that tradition of remarkable poets in the Indigenous writing community. In the fiction area, we're so lucky. We've had, certainly in the 2000s, 4 Miles Franklin winners, all so deserved: Melissa Lukashenko, Alexis Wright, Tara June Wentz, Kim Scott, all great novelists. And I think that Adam Thompson, a great short story writer, Blackfellow from Tasmania, I've loved his recent work. There are, of course, so many others. I think the point here, though, Roger, and for any, if there are any Aboriginal writers in the audience tonight, or emerging writers, I think what's so great now is that there are so many people out there publishing that, for younger people, there are great role models in our community. There are great people to speak to be mentored by, to have friendship with. And what I mean by that is that when I go to a writers' festival or event now, so if I went to a mainstream writers' festival, if I'd gone there 10 years ago, there might be another Aboriginal writer on the bill. for some reason the audiences there'd be too many hostile people in the audiences who'd ask you really adversarial questions, and then you'd always leave with a bad taste in your mouth, or end up dropping your politeness and getting into an argument with someone, which is not good. When I go to writers' festivals now, there's usually half a dozen more blackfellas, writers from all over the country. It's great to meet up with them. It's great to be supported by them. And particularly for me, like I was talking to someone today, like when I go to writers' festival, particularly if we have new writers there. So when Evelyn Araluen had her first book of poems published, we make sure older mob like Melissa Lukashenko and I, because we usually catch up with each other a bit, a guy called Jared Thomas in South Australia, we'll always make sure we go to those people's events so that they know there are other people in the audience, more senior people, and not to be like an uncle or an elder or anything like that, but just to say we're here to support you. So it's just a really rich time to be in a writing community of Aboriginal people from all over the country that you get to meet each other and share time with. It's probably the most joyous part of being a writer is catching up with all of those people and meeting new people.
It seems like quite an endorsement for the writers' festivals that we're missing at the moment around the country, to be a part of, like as an audience, to be able to witness that is going to be something we're all looking forward to participating in again. I want to move from reading to writing, and you mentioned earlier in the conversation that if you had to make the choice between reading and writing, you would pick reading because writing is hard. I wonder if you could talk about the challenges that you face as a writer. And I wonder, like, there's two questions here. What's the easiest thing that you find to write about? And then what's the hardest thing?
Well, no, the hardest is I don't do it anymore, was academic writing. It's, I published quite a bit of academic work in both, contests in colonial history and in climate justice. It's almost physical writing academic work. You'll be sitting at your desk and you got your laptop and you got 50 sources around you and you're trying to find footnotes. And it's like, I always, academic writing is like like wrestling, it's too physical. And when I would get up out of my desk after a day of an academic exercise, I actually would feel it in my body, like I'd be hunched over like an old man. So it's a very unhealthy form of writing. So obviously you'd be, well, I was going to say you'd be happy when you finished. I think you'd be more relieved when you finished with the academic work. So I think that when I say it can be hard, I think what it is that quite literally, when you're writing fiction, say, and you want to write a scene as best you can, whether it be a conversation or particularly description of action, which I find. So in my novel Blood, I remember the boy, the 13-year-old boy, Jesse, he's being chased by this criminal called Limbo, and Jesse literally choreographs Limbo's demise, timing when he will run across a highway. But I think it might be 2 pages, thinking about that in a sort of time frame, in a 3-dimensional way of pace. There is what happens, I think, with me as a writer, you get to a point where it's hard to do it, and a moment goes through your brain, or your creative part of your brain goes, I'll just do it this way, this is easiest. And that's when you've got to stop writing, because it means that you can't tackle it at that point and you're looking for a shortcut. The same as you would at any job you're doing at home, whether you're painting or something, I'll just do this or I'll just do that. And you bugger it up. So the hardest part for writing is when the words that you want to use or the words that you assemble on the page don't match what you're thinking, what you're hoping to create. So that can be frustrating. And it's obvious, I think, with poetry, where, to be very simplistic, there are less words usually, is that you can never quite get what you want on the page. But with poetry, I accept that as a reality of the poem is always something always elusive about what you're trying to convey and what you put on the page. So the hardest part is those challenges. when I say the easiest, I suppose the most enjoyable is that when I get an idea for a short story, and I tend to have a method or a process for writing a short story, I will think of it. I might write a brief note, but nothing more. And I will carry the idea around in my head. And I'm going to say something now that my creative writing students used to hate, and they put it on all those surveys. Will he stop talking about running? So I've been running for 40 years, and what I'll tend to do is I've got an idea for a short story and I'll go out for a long run. And these days my long runs are getting slower, so it gives me more time to think about it. And I will literally start to frame the story, frame scenes, and then a day comes when I realize, okay, I've got it now. I've got the structure, I've got the backbone, and I write. I usually pick a day where I could write all day, and I often get a full draft of the story done because I've planned so much. That's the most enjoyable writing, because it does tend to come easy enough, or that at the end of that day with the draft, I think, yeah, this is a story that if I persevere with this draft, in other words, now do all the shaving and shaping, I think I'll have a publishable story. And I say publishable because it's important to say to people, I'm relatively successful writer, but you still get knockbacks. So you're sending your short stories off, you still get rejections. That's the life of a writer. Rejection is another aspect of the work, and that you've got to take that. So writing short stories, I would say, is the most enjoyable. And with the novels, it's very strange that even with The White Girl, which I really felt comfortable with when I'd finished, with my short stories, I tend to think, yeah, I think people will like this story. With the novels, I haven't got a clue. If someone had wrote a review and said this is the worst thing since sliced bread, I'd probably say, yeah, they're probably right. So I don't have that same sense of it working. It's a peculiar sense. I'll feel satisfied emotionally, but I'm never confident how people are going to receive the novel.
It's I'm intrigued by you talk about how you use running as a metaphor or a strategy for working things out. I'm intrigued now to ask you about poetry in those terms. Is that is there running involved in that, or is there another physiological?
No, just down to the milk bar. Poetry is very different because I published 2 collections, and as I said, in the 80s and 90s, I published only poetry. Some were very bad. I mean, I think if you're a poet, if you haven't written a bad poem, you're not a real poet. But it is a very different process. The second point would be I write my poems during quite intense periods, so that whisper songs, with the exception of a couple of poems, were written in a very intensive period around first lockdown last year. And I would say that 80% of that collection, I would have written those poems sort of within 3 months of between March and the middle of last year. I'm doing the same thing now. The interesting point here, which answers your question, is that I often think of, I have a really great interest in photography, and I take a lot of photographs. Not that they're any good, but I take photographs for documentation for places I'm going to write about. I take photographs, I do a lot of photographs of family. I love the still image, and one of the reasons I love the still image is that it's supposed to be sort of, and I don't want to go over the history of photography as a technology, but people used to talk about photography as the pencil of nature, or the eye of history. In other words, it was exact, or it was positivist. And in fact, the still image has many, many layers of story and meaning that are quite infinite. So if you look at a childhood photograph of one of your kids or family, and then as you look at it over the years, the photograph changes. There's something else in the photograph that you didn't realize. There's something about the person as they grow that you see in the childhood photograph. I think of poetry in the same way. So for me, I like writing and reading poetry that's fairly accessible on the first read, like looking at a picture. But as you go back to the poem, you realize that there's something more. There's always something to learn from the poem. So I tend to write poems in that way. I'll see something and I do imagine as a frame, as a still image. So a lot of my poems exist only on one page. with the exception that I also have a history of writing what are called archive poems. And I've done those for many years, which are very different poems. They're what I might call interrogation of colonial archives, interrogation of colonial language, to produce poems which forces the colonial document to speak in a way that it would rather not speak. In other words, in regard to violence against Aboriginal people, the colonial document itself might be quite dry or, on the surface look banal. What I try to do with the poems is surprise that open and show something else. So the poetry, a lot of them are like a photograph. They're like snapshots.
For those people who are in the audience in Townsville, you can find Mary Who books, and there are some archive poems in this latest collection, I believe.
Yeah.
We are just checking the time. We are pushing up against our time limit soon. So I'm going to ask you that question about place. Anybody who's read your fiction or poetry, that there's this strong connection to place, and particularly that childhood place in which you grew up, but all sorts of places. I wonder if you would just talk a little bit about that as we keep an eye on the clock, about the way that you connect to that place, and particularly the streets of Fitzroy and the river, and how you've aimed to evoke that connection through your fiction and poetry.
Yeah, so I think the thing to say would be that my relationship, even though that I might be writing in some instances what we might call historical work, my relationship or the impetus for writing about these places is always begins in a very contemporary setting. So as you just said, I still live in Fitzroy, or I moved back here recently, but I've always lived around the inner city, and I walk everywhere if I'm not running. So I'm always walking around with my camera, taking photographs, and I'm also spending a lot of time on the Birrarung, so that all my running is around the river or walking around the river. Look after my grandson Archie once a week, and I take him down to the river. And what I mean by that is, Roger, that it's only in those daily interactions that I will either be triggered by a memory, or that I will see something in a very contemporary sense that really attracts me to place. So once those triggers occur, I then might think about how that might evolve into a story, or see what spins out of that. But the second thing is that why I'm really attracted to place is that it doesn't just inform our story making. It's that what we've got to understand is when you go to any place, story is happening. So story is always occurring. So where I'm sitting now and look out the window and there are people walking by, that's a performance. That's people engaged in narrative. So that when I think about place, I think I immerse myself in a place where story is all around me. And when I'm writing about a place that, even if it's fiction, that is based on a real place, I like to visit, take some photographs, take some notes, because what is happening there might be important to incorporate into the story. So when I taught short fiction, or fiction generally, I would talk to students about getting a sense of place, and that might be just smell, the sights, the shapes, etc. But more than that, it's about what impact does a particular place have on people walking through it, engaging in it, sitting in it. So this, of course, is something that you speak to Aboriginal people on country, particularly outside cities that have been flattened in a way. Country's been flattened by development. An Aboriginal person talking about country, they're not only talking about the senses around them, they're talking about themselves as integral to that place. So their sense of who they are is integral to that place. What I believe is, although I live in an inner city area, and people often say, oh, to experience Aboriginal country, you've got to go outside the city. For me, growing up here, I'd say, well, this is the city I've got. This in deep time is still an Aboriginal place. So what I learned from that is that the way that we engage with this place is by inhabiting it and recognize other people who inhabit it. It's why people on the margins, homeless people, people who are struggling often appear in my fiction. It's not because I'm trying to be a do-gooder or, they're not about social justice. They're saying these people are really important to place because these are the people who we often see on the streets who have a story about this place, and it's important that we not only listen to what they have to say, that as fictional characters, we can incorporate those stories into our fiction, and we can, through that, alert readers to the fact that these people who we often are blind to or invisible to, they have real depth of character, and they have a story that is as dignified as anyone else's.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I know you wanted to talk about was the importance of story being owned and told by specific nations and mob around the country. I mean, we're going to have people online in various parts of Australia. I don't know if we have any overseas listeners at all, but it's possible. But anybody who's sitting in the Central Plaza here in Townsville will have some sort of a feeling about a place that they occupy in the way that you've been describing. I wonder if you, so in this, we're into this space where we'll close and start to answer some questions. I wonder if you would like to finish by talking about the importance of story being owned and told by specific nations and mob.
Yeah, well, and I don't, look, one is I know that can be controversial, but for me as a writer, it's not. I think that the very fact is that First Nations people in Australia, Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islander people, we've had our stories taken from us. We've often had our stories erased. We've had our stories misconstrued and commodified by non-Aboriginal people. And I think we have the right to take ownership of those stories and to speak for ourselves and to tell them for ourselves. I think as a writer that I understand that in relationship to stories of other people, so that one of the things that I would say to anyone, it's not an issue of censorship to choose not to write about a particular people. It's the fact that it's an act of generosity, of recognition to say, no, this is the time for you to tell your story, and it's my time to read it or to listen. And I think there's a correlation here, so that if I was thinking particularly, say, of refugee and asylum seeker communities, and we can say very strongly that historically in Australia in the last 2 decades, yeah, there's an attempt to obliterate the humanity of people who are struggling and want to come to Australia for sanctuary. I don't think it's my place to write stories about the refugee struggle. It's my place to listen to refugee people and what they have to say. And if I can offer anything, there are other ways that I can engage with those people other than trying to tell their story by working with people, as I've done writing workshops with refugee communities, so I can contribute to the development of a literature. I do think there is, and I'd mentioned this earlier, there is an issue of complexity though, because if you're a writer, an Australian non-Aboriginal writer, and you have a sense of value of this country and place, and you write about it, there is a question of how you do that, and of course, how you interact with Aboriginal people. So I wouldn't suggest for any moment that these are not complex issues. And I, by the way, wouldn't say outright, Roger, I wouldn't say outright that a non-Aboriginal person should not include Aboriginal characters in their work. I think it's a complex journey that people have to take, and it's one that has to be taken with a lot of thought, and I think hopefully a lot of engagement. So I think we're in a really rich time in Australia where we can actually make these issues important to the culture we want to create and see it as a real challenge of value rather than a difficulty that we can't face. So I think people should think about, okay, what are the great dynamic changes that we can make in Australia's sort of creative cultures by actually looking at these issues and addressing them front on.
I had one final question. It was about the role of the storyteller in the current time. I think you've just answered it. With time coming upon us, I'm going to go to some of the questions that have been coming in. We have about, whoops, that's me making noise there. We have about 8 minutes, I think, to answer some of the questions that have come in. And one of them,
I'll do it quickly then.
Yep. What do you think of writing purely for pleasure, just without publication in any?
It's absolutely vital. I mean, I know people who have done that their whole life, and you know, people have found great family stories in bottom drawers. But I think writing for pleasure is also, what is writing doing? Ultimately, it gives you periods of contemplation, periods of reflection, periods of meditation. So I think it's wonderful if people are writing for pleasure. And I think essentially that, you know, most people who write are not published. That's the reality. So no, I wouldn't be critical of it at all. And I think for many people, it's when I say therapeutic, I don't mean that in a deeply psychological way. I think writing for me, if people say, what does writing do? Essentially, it helps you make sense of the world. So I think if people are writing to make sense of the world, I think it's great. I would encourage it.
From a question about writing, there's a few questions about publishing and reading. One of them is connects art and visual art and writing.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if Tony might comment on the early acknowledgement of Indigenous art as mainstream back in the 1970s, whereas Indigenous writing has taken much longer to become mainstream.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting, because I think what there, and I, by the way, this is not a comment on the artist, is that I think that with artists that the marketplace for art also is a commodity. So people, I think, rather than sometimes see the true value of art that was coming out in the 70s, really exoticized it against the wishes of Aboriginal people. And I think with writers, why it has taken longer is that we're less exotic than people think we are. They want something exotic out of us, and I think sometimes we willfully refuse to deliver that. So that we do notice when we go to festivals, people would like us to be much more exotic than we are, or to perform the Aborigine, and we refuse to do that. So I think as a commodity or as a packaged product, it's been much more difficult to sell us, and I think that's a good thing, because again, this thing, Roger, about having this great community of writers that I know, is that we watch each other's back and give each other tips. And young Aboriginal people who are publishing for the first time, the most common question I get is, how do I get to be true to what I want to do, rather than what a publisher or a festival or a marketer wants me to do? How can I be true to myself? Because they can very quickly get dragged into a persona that they're not comfortable with. And it's one of the things that we guard against.
There's another question about publishing, and I think this might lend itself to access to story as well. I'll see how you respond to this one. Do you think that cheap books and ebooks encourage reading or devalue writing?
Did you say cheap books?
It's cheap books, yeah.
Well, the cheapest books I ever buy is from op shops. You can't get much cheaper than book. I'm not sure if it means self-published ebooks or just the fact of having ebooks available. Firstly, I'll try and answer in both ways. My ebook sales, I think, like most writers, are about 20% of my sales. I don't have any qualms about how I'm read. And people might say, well, you may not make as much money out of an ebook because it sells for less, the retail is less. I've got a feeling we still get the same royalty, although I'm not sure. But the fact is, to remember this, you also have hundreds, if not thousands, of readers of your books who borrow your books through public libraries. There is a small amount that comes back to you through that, but it's very small in a relative sense. So that if I was worried about my earnings of books, you'd say, well, you'd want people to buy your book rather than read it in a library. Well, I actually don't feel that. I feel people should read my work as any way they can get it. Swapping it between friends, reading it as a library reader. And it's really vital, because I've said this many times, the public library is, I think, our most valued public institution, or one of them. And when I go to public libraries and sit with readers who are library borrowers, they are so savvy around reading. Their reading habits are incredible. So that on that sense, if the question's about the sales price, I'm not concerned at all. On cheap books, I'm not sure what the question is about, except to say if you can get a good book cheap, get it.
Yes, I know I think the White Girl is available in audiobook, and I know somebody close to me who is reading the White Girl in that way. So it's access to story, I think, is the important thing to think about here. However, like as you say, however you can get it.
Yeah, and I mean, one of my kids, I mean, when my first book came out, she said, I haven't got time to read it, and she just played it on audio in the car when she was driving home. Like, that's fine.
This might be the last question, and it's still about reading. So there is a and this one is a bit of concern about reading, given the importance of reading and writing in the lives and development of young people, including yourself as a young boy. How worried are you by the apparent decline in reading in young people in this age of screens? What might it mean for children's emotional and psychological development and for the future of writing and storytelling? That's a big question.
I mean, it's a good question to finish up, and it's a sort of inverse of my experience, because my possible or potential lack of being able to read would have been poverty, essentially, so that I was saved from an absence of reading by the public library, as I said. What's happening today is that, of course, there are many kids who have, and I don't say this in too loaded a way, but privilege of being able to access all sorts of social media and online platforms through their tablets, telephones, computers, etc. The two things I would say is that, and I know this was apparent when I was finishing creative writing teaching, there is a problem that there's a lot of research, and I don't think enough done in Australia, about the absorption of information or the absorption of knowledge reading from a screen as opposed to a printed page. The tactile nature of the page, the notion of people reading down and skimming a page, can have an impact. I think that people tend to speed read and skim generally when they're reading on screen, so that is a problem. I think, of course, a lot of product that's developed, not the e-readers, so there are people who read novels in a dedicated way with e-readers, but there is a way that I think that a lot of what we might have thought is writing of essays, and here I'm talking about in the public domain, is that a lot of stuff is produced in almost dot point, single sentence paragraphs, so that is a really poor form of both reading and potentially of encouraging writing. Now, having said that, I think that it is a matter of us seeking out material and trying to encourage that in our kids, so that you can still get, you can actually get really great long form essays online. So there's an online site called Aeon, who have great philosophy, nature, climate, political essays that you can read for free every day. 2,000 word, 3,000 word, 5,000 word essays, which are really high quality. So you can get access to really good quality material if you seek it out. I think that the problem is in the wider culture, like the questioner. I'm concerned about what it is that we value. And as we know, with a lot of technologies, everything is being done in more minute bits, and we're doing too much too quickly. So you heard of the slow food phenomenon. We need a slow life phenomenon, and that's hard. That's hard to because the rest of the world is going so quick. The only good thing, or one of the things that have come out of lockdown, is that I can't go anywhere. So we've developed habits of reading a lot of the night, sort of bedding down with a book, and so that I think those things. As with the question, I'm anxious about that. I have grandchildren, and I'm anxious about their reading habits, and I don't have an answer. I only say it is a very serious challenge, and I have the same concerns as the questioner.
And with that challenge to everybody listening, wherever you are, we have run out of time, and I see Paul Hadisti on the screen. I'd like to pass on my thanks to Tony for this conversation, and for all that you contributed to Australian literature. I've got the books in here, and I'm doing some rereading at the morning, Tony. But I'd like to pass on to Paul now to draw the evening's events to a conclusion.
Yeah,
you
look,
very much.
thanks. Thank you so much, Roger, and Tony, especially for that great conversation. And unfortunately, I'm the person that's hurrying us up towards the end and putting that extra pressure on everybody. But it's been a delightful conversation. I'm sure the audience has completely enjoyed it. And I really, personally, as both a longtime reader and writer, love hearing your thoughts about both reading and writing and how they work together, how they're really inseparable, two sides of the same coin in many ways. So thank you so much. So for everybody, thanks guys, really appreciate it. Take care. For everybody else who's joined us, we have another event to celebrate later this evening, actually in a few minutes. It's the Margaret and Colin Roderick Literary Award. So this $20,000 award, it's one of the premier awards in Australian literature, recognizing the best Australian book of the year, dealing with any aspect of Australian life in any genre. This award, the Margaret and Colin Roderick Literary Award, recognizes the best Australian book of the year, dealing with any aspect of Australian life. So thanks everybody for joining us for this lecture. It's been fantastic, and stay tuned, stick around. In 15 minutes or so, we'll be starting the award ceremony proper. Thanks very much. Well, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. And welcome to the Margaret and Colin Roderick Literary Award evening. My name is Paul Hardesty, and I'm the chairman of the Foundation for Australian Literary Studies, and I'm talking to you, unfortunately, from Perth in Western Australia, not because it's not a great place to be, but because I wish I was there with you and joining the many people who are joining us live in person at James Cook University. And also may I welcome all the people who are joining online around the country. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first inhabitants of this country, and pay our respects to traditional owners of the land on which many of us are standing today at James Cook University, the Bindal and Wilgaruka people. And in the spirit of reconciliation, we also acknowledge the valuable contribution that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have made, not only to James Cook University, but also to the whole Australian community. And I pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. First, some acknowledgements. I'd like to acknowledge the Chancellor of James Cook University, Mr. Bill Trudell. There he is. Hi, Bill. Thanks for joining us today. The Vice Chancellor of James Cook University for a little while longer, Sandra Harding. She was also the Deputy Chair of the Foundation. I'd like to also acknowledge FALS Life Governors, the Honorable Kieran Cullen, Adjunct Professor Donat Gallagher, Adjunct Professor Stephen Torre, and board members, board directors of the Foundation, our members, and our supporters. And in particular, I'll be introducing in a little while, the lady on my right, our chair of our judging panel, Dr. Lee Dale, also Emeritus Professor Alan Dawson, Mary Vernon, and Kathy McLennan. Also, a special welcome to our shortlisted authors, whose covers of whose books was on the placeholder just before we started. Consolation by Gary Disher, Melting Moments by Anna Goldsworthy, The Survivors by Jane Harper, Infinite Splendor by Sophie Laguna, Louise Milligan's Witness, and A Lonely Girl is a Dangerous Thing by Jessie Tu. So for 55 years, the Colin Roderick Literary Award has recognized the best original book published in Australia during the previous calendar year. With such a broad scope, the award has been given to a wide range of publications, including volumes of poetry, fiction, history, travel writing, natural history, memoir, and biography. And coupled with the H.T. Priestley Memorial Medal, which will be symbolically awarded tonight as well, the $20,000 prize lends encouragement to writers, injects financial support, and over the course of time constitutes a mark of distinction in the careers of some of Australia's most significant and distinguished writers. First known as the Foundation for Australian Literary Studies Award, the name of the award was changed in 1991 to honor Colin Roderick's long contribution to Australian literature and to mark the 25th anniversary of the award. This year, I'm really pleased to also announce that the name of the award has been slightly adjusted again to the Margaret and Colin Roderick Literary Award in recognition of the outstanding and incredible role that Colin's late wife, Margaret, has played in the growth and profile, not only of the award, but of the foundation itself. Colin Roderick was firstly an editor, a publisher, a promoter, and secondly, a scholar of Australian literature. His legacy is his public-facing work for raising the profile of Australian literature in the public sphere. He was instrumental in setting up the Miles Franklin Award, and this award, the Margaret and Colin Roderick Award, is a version of that, except perhaps more general and expansive in ways that reflect his vision, which was about supporting all kinds of Australian writers of all classes and types in all genres and connecting them to the broader reading public. A longtime advocate of Australian literature, Roderick established the Foundation for Australian Literary Studies, an annual lecture series of which we just heard Tony Birch deliver a really fascinating conversation, and the annual literary award that we now know as the Margaret and Colin Roderick Literary Award. During his long career, he wrote more than 50 books and many articles on the history of Australian literature. And throughout his time at James Cook University, he continued to produce scholarship on the work of such major figures as Henry Lawson, Rosa Parade, Miles Franklin, and Banjo Patterson. In 2000, Colin Roderick died at the age of 89 years. Recent winners of the award include writers as diverse as Peter Carey, Don Watson, Karen Kassan, Michael Cathcart, Thomas Keneally, and Gail Jones. And most recently, the award has recognized Josephine Wilson's novel Extinction, Jacques Sarong's On Java Ridge, which I love, and Robert Drew's collection of short stories, The True Color of the Sea. A full list of winners is available on our website, and the Margaret and Colin Roderick Literary Award continues to acknowledge and reward excellence in all forms of Australian writing, achieving its aim of making a lasting contribution to the production and appreciation of Australian literature. I'd like now to introduce Dr. Lee Dale, who is the chair of the judging panel and who will describe the judging process and introduce the shortlist. But before I hand over to you, Lee, I'm just going to embarrass you a little bit with reading a bit of your biography, which is very impressive. Lee Dale taught Australian and other literatures at the University of Southern Queensland, the University of Queensland, and the University of Wollongong, where she also supervised honors, masters, and doctoral theses on Australian literature. She was editor of the journal Australian Literary Studies from 2002 to 2015, and is the author of the book, The Enchantment of English, Professing Literature in Australian Universities, as well as Responses to Self-Harm. Lee has published criticism of a range of Australian writers and articles and book chapters on higher education and colonial history. Her first year of judging the Colin Roderick Award was in 2017, and she's continued in that role until today. Lee, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. You're very kind. I would like to begin by paying my respects to Indigenous elders past and present, and to acknowledge the sovereignty of the Bindal and Woolgoorukaba people of the Townsville region. It's my job to introduce the books on the shortlist, as Paul said, but first I'm going to say a little bit about the field, the judging process, and I'm also going to run very quickly through the long list so that you have a sense of how we got to this evening. And it's taken quite a while because it was around this time last year that the FALS administrator, Marge Naylor, who does a one posting boxes out to judges during this process, but fortunately there were no floods or fires as there were last year. In the Colin and Margaret Roderick Literary Award for this year, we had exactly 200 entries. And I know that that is much larger than most other Australian literary prizes. Indeed, it's the largest I'm aware of. Over the last 5 years, we've generally longlisted around 7% of books. So in a university context, I like to think that a long list is making the long list is a very clear high distinction. Those books not in contention tonight, because they did not make the shortlist, include Stephen Conte's majestically poetic novel, The Tolstoy Estate, Stephanie Convery's insightful and empathic After the Count, the story of the death of the boxer Davy Brown, Daniel Caron and Tony Park's very blunt and absorbing story of an Australian VC winner, Grantley Chiesa's lively and panoramic biography, Banks, which I saw in the airport shop on the way here, Tobias McCorkle's Everything in Its Right Place, which has a finely and astutely drawn portrait of a working class Melbourne boy, Kirley Saunders' gentle and very funny Bindi, a poetry collection for younger readers, especially if you're a hockey player, Nadi Simpson's sprawling and sympathetic novel, Song of the Crocodile, Elizabeth Tan's extraordinarily imaginative short story collection, Smart Ovens for Lonely People, and Mark Wilson's Eureka, a story of the goldfields, which made history by being the first children's book longlisted for the Roderick. Some of these books have collected other awards, and I do really urge you to seek them out. There are some absolute gems there. But now to the shortlist. And just as a change, I'm going to use alphabetical order by book title to introduce them. And if you watch me very carefully, you might see if I give away the winner. I hope I don't. I'll start with A Lonely Girl is a Dangerous Thing by first-time novelist Jessie Tu, which is a brilliant blend of wild ride and existential angst. It tells the story of a young musician who's both seduced and betrayed by the world of classical music, in which everyone is competing to get on that next step of the ladder. It's not a book for the faint-hearted. It's a very powerful story of a young woman's attempt to negotiate her career and her emotional life with family and with partners on her own terms. Consolation is the third in the Constable Paul Hirschhausen series, about a country copper who isn't especially liked by his superiors, nor indeed by the more swanky folk around town, but he's got a wonderfully sharp eye for things that don't look quite right. Gary Disher, a renowned crime writer, gives us a laid-back Australian rural version of the whodunit, with details of country landscapes, small-town society, and criminal spite, all as finely drawn as a Phryne Fisher set, albeit that there are dogs and dust rather than sex and silk. Infinite Splendours is by Sophie Laguna, whose reputation would perhaps lie equally in writing for children and younger people and in writing for adults. This novel blends the two in telling the story of a boy, Lawrence Lohman, who very much makes his own way in the world, or perhaps more accurately, makes his own world as an artist, as a recluse, and as a person irreparably damaged by childhood experience. All of these aspects, particularly his emotional life, are rendered in compelling detail. Melting Moments, likewise, is a novel about a single life, this time of a suburban woman whose apparently cliched life is told with sympathy and subtlety. Anna Goldsworthy, the author, gives fine-grained details of domestic life, and she isn't afraid to expose readers to intimacy and conflict. Melting Moments is a novel that asks us to pay attention to all the things I feel are taken for granted about women's lives in the middle decades of the 20th century. Jane Harper has built a strong reputation as a purveyor of rural noir, but she turns to the seaside in her 2020 novel, The Survivors. Like Dish's book, this mystery or set of mysteries, I see the award winner is getting anxious, is set in a small town where the only thing harder than forgiving is forgetting. Survivors asks deeper questions too about grief, memory, and commemoration, especially in families. And finally, the only non-fiction book on the shortlist is Louise Milligan's Witness. This book focuses on the aftermath of crime in analysing the process of prosecution and the offering of courtroom testimony. And Milligan asks, what's the price? What's the price paid by victims of paedophilia when they're forced to reveal intimate details of sexual assault? Witness brings the culture of prosecution under the microscope, and what we see isn't very flattering. These are 6 wonderful books. I'm going to hand you back to the chair of the board of the Foundation for Australian Literary Studies at James Cook University of North Queensland, Professor Paul Hardesty, to announce which of the authors is the winner of the Margaret and Colin Roderick Award for 2021.
Thanks, Sophie. And as you read through those little gems, those little encapsulations of these novels, I couldn't help but thinking that it must have been for you and the panel an extraordinarily difficult process. I know you read hundreds of books, but to whittle such an amazing field down, and we have chatted, not about who the winner is until recently, but it must have been so difficult for you. So well done, and not an envious, not something that I think anyone would envy in terms of a job. But look, it's my great honor and privilege to announce that the winner of the 2021 Margaret and Colin Roderick Prize for Literature goes to Sophie Laguna for her novel Infinite Splendors. So Sophie, you can imagine that there's a whole group of people, over 100, I think, in the main central area in James Cook University, are all clapping and cheering and raising a glass of wine or beer to you on a beautiful evening there, out under the stars. You can't obviously be here or be there to see it in person, but I'm sure it's the warmest congratulations. So over to you.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands from which I'm speaking, the Wurundjeri people. I would also like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands in which my novel is set, the Gunditjmara and the Eastern Maar peoples. I want to thank the late Professor Colin Roderick and his wife, the late Mrs. Margaret Roderick, and the Foundation for Australian Literary Studies, its board of directors, the Chancellor of James Cook University, and to all those who continue to support the Foundation and make this event possible. Thank you also to everyone who's out there tonight, both virtually and, under the stars in Queensland. I so appreciate your attention at this time. I want to acknowledge, of course, the shortlisted writers, Gary Disher, Jane Harper, Anna Goldsworthy, Louise Milligan, and Jessica Tu. Thank you for your fine work. I'm honoured to be writing alongside you and humbled to be the recipient of the 2021 Margaret and Colin Roderick Literary Award. The first time I've said that. Writers don't write books with prizes in mind. Writing comes from a place within us, I think, that doesn't know what prizes are or what awards are all about. But to have our work acknowledged in this very public way is deeply affirming, not to mention helpful in the most practical of ways, life-changing. I'm going to be grateful and proud and thrilled about this all at once for the rest of my days. I want to thank first the judges, the chair of the judging panel, Dr. Lee Dale, and the other judges, Emeritus Professor Alan Lawson, Mrs. Mary Vernon, retired Deputy Editor of the Townsville Bulletin, Magistrate Kathy McLennan, and Emeritus Professor Sue Martin. Again, I'm going to feel bonded with you, judges. again, for the rest of my days, whether you're going to be aware of that bond or not, that's how I'm going to feel. I'm just thrilled that you saw Lawrence, the central character of my book, Infinite Splendors, and wanted to celebrate and acknowledge this story. I'm so very proud and so grateful. Of course, I wish I could express my gratitude and appreciation and my excitement in person there, but I hope that you can feel it across the virtual divide, and know, please know that it means more to me at this time, perhaps than any other. Certainly, I think books have never been more important. The degree of communication they afford us, the intimacy and connection and release. And I am speaking, I suppose, here for literary fiction, although I'm aware that what makes the Margaret and Colin Roderick Award so special is that it includes books of all types. But it is for literary fiction that I speak. And these books enable us to, I think, face difficult truths and to understand ourselves more deeply. They show us other sides, and that can be inconvenient in a way. The best fiction teaches us that there are no absolutes, that every argument contains its counterpoint, that human beings are endlessly, impossibly contradictory, flawed, fascinating, and wonderful. I think that the best fiction functions a little like dreams, potent, sometimes frightening, impossible to pin down. You know, it feels to me as if books, the best books, have souls, and we need these souls living amongst us. I'd like to read now from Infinite Splendors, a short reading from the middle of the book. I'm sorry if I sound nervous. I am nervous. It's very different to sort of, you know, being in front of people. I'm in the intimacy of my home space, but it's still very nerve-wracking, very exciting. That evening, I lit the fire in the wood stove, sat in Mother's rocker, and studied the catalogue from Parker's. There were different kinds of paints listed: Horing's water palette, Genoa oils, 36 colours comprehensive, 12 acrylic starter set. There was a multitude of drawing pencils, Ebony Fabers, Derwents, Blendwells, crayons, Milton Bradley's broad lines, Ludwig soft pastels, Talon's coloured. I turned the page and saw canvases of all sizes: 24 by 30 inches, 36 by 48, 18 by 24, and sketchbooks with paper of different kinds: Edgeley's, Normandy's, artist's own. There were pastels and inks and charcoals, as well as cleaning products. I rocked Mother's chair back and forth, and the fire warmed my feet. Now there was a reason for a wage. I milked the cow, and the milk went to the city, and I was paid. The money went to Parker's, and the paint came back to me, and that was how the world turned. Ha ha! Milk to paint, milk to paint. What is the difference? I spoke to my feet resting against the guard. What is the difference? I lay in bed that night and could not sleep. Although I had been on the earth for 24 years, it was as if my life was only beginning now. This was the first day the bird clock ticked. I switched on the lamp, picked up letters from the masters, and turned to a painting by Master Millet. A field in spring, a rainbow arching over rain-filled clouds. I ran my fingers over the tree in the foreground, heavy with fruit, the path of dirt, the sky of blue and grey. Beside the painting was a letter by Master Millet to the historian Alfred Sensier. I see far more in the countryside than charm. I see infinite splendours. I remember, you know, the very first moment I began the story, it was, I began to write, you know, by hand in a notebook in the voice of Lawrence Lohman. And when I first encountered him, he was already middle-aged, and he had this dark sort of a compulsion to disappear underground, physically, literally, for periods of time. And I needed to understand why. And I didn't expect to care as much as I did. It was mysterious. I didn't see it coming. His childhood and its unspoken trauma, his painful transition into adulthood, and his life as an artist. I wanted to show, I think, the price that the boy would pay, but more than that, I wanted him to survive. I wanted to show the redemptive nature of art, show how it heals and contains and provides meaning. I wanted Lawrence to find a path forward. Although he suffered in darkness, he was drawn to the light, fascinated always by the way it shone behind clouds, the way it illuminated his beloved mountain. Everything depended on the sky, just as one of his heroes, John Constable, had taught him in his letters. Lawrence was a soothing presence in my life. As I wrote him, I felt him there every day, walking beside me, anti-heroic, gifted, tortured, eccentric. You know, all the while I wrote him, it felt as if, not as if I was giving him life, but as if he was giving it to me. I loved the mountain alongside him. I learned the bliss of walking to its summit. I saw the moon balancing on its peak at night. I too painted the sky, breathed the clean, crisp air. It was blissful. I miss it. Lawrence took a new road, stepping forward, great strides with those long, gangly legs, woolen hat pulled low. He kept going forward into the question. Such a great artist, devoted. His most fruitful relationship was with his natural environment. His relationships with people were so limited. He knew he couldn't manage, and so he removed himself. It was the moral thing to do, the only thing to do. Is that what made him a hero for me? Regardless of his self-imposed exile, people found him in the end. Life's like that, don't you think? It has to be in order for us, the stories of our lives to move forward. You know, I'm sometimes asked if it was a difficult thing or an upsetting thing to write particular moments in the book, but working from the inside, it was very different. It was never unsafe, always the opposite. Well, I never questioned if it was safe or unsafe, just felt buzzing with energy. It was like being immersed in a game of craft and interplay between characters, the music of the book, an intoxicating privilege, really. I was contained every day, every ordinary, difficult day, by the boundaries of Lawrence's world, the house and the field, the bunker and the mountain, Hamilton Modern Dairy and the road that led there. I want to thank the Australia Council and Creative Victoria for their generous support, buying me valuable writing time, giving me the space to keep going. I'm deeply appreciative. I want to thank those who brought the book into the world, my wonderful publishing house, Allen and Unwin. I've always been charmed by the way publishing companies are called publishing houses. I always picture a home. And, you know, if Allen and Unwin is a house, I'm definitely home. Jane Polframan. I want to thank you, publisher, my publisher, for your loyalty, your belief in me, your trust, your willingness to dive in deep and to take risks. I've said it before, I'm happy to say it again. Voice of the people, thank you. I'm very, very lucky. Ali Laval, Krista Munn, Sandy Cull for making the book so beautiful, Jane Finnemore and Christine Farmer for bringing putting the book out there into the public. Richard and Sue Walsh, thank you for your kindness and patience, your steadfastness and constancy, more like family than friends. And lastly, I would like to thank my husband, Mark McBride, for helping me so much, for always honouring the work, for making it all possible with the children and with my beloved characters. Thank you for your insight, your loyalty, and being such an oracle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Beautiful speech, great reading. Love the way, you know, you just picked that perfect little nugget right out of the middle of the book just to give us all a great reason to want to read it. So beautiful. I'm going to now ask the Chancellor of James Cook University, Mr. Bill Trudell, to ceremonially and virtually present you with the H.T. Priestley Medal, which also goes along with the prize itself. Look, the medal itself is on the way to you. Obviously, with all the lockdowns and everything, we couldn't, you know, hang it around your neck today. But Bill, are you able to sort of virtually show show everybody what the medal looks like. And there you go, beautiful. You know, a really, you know, I think there's not a writer alive in Australia that wouldn't, you know, die for that medal, I guess. So yeah, thank you so much. Well done.
So
Well deserved.
exciting. Thank you, Paul. Thank you.
Do you want to say anything, Bill?
Yeah, I would, if you don't mind.
Please.
Thank you very much for that. And thank you to Lee also for your comments. It's a real honour, Sophie, to be here to present the H.T. Priestley Medal to you. It's especially so as I'm actually one of Colin Roderick's former students, almost quite literally half a century ago. And Tom, as some may know, was Deputy Chancellor of the University and the founding chairman of the Foundation for Australian Literary Studies. Others have paid their tributes to Indigenous Australians. I too want to pay that respect because my university, our university, conducts its business on the lands and the seas of many of Australia's Indigenous people, and it is right and proper and a solemn duty for us to acknowledge that and to pay respect to their elders, past, present, and those who will emerge in the future. So Priestley was perhaps the Foundation's most zealous devotee. He passed away, as it happens, in August of '79, and to mark his influential service, this medal was born, the H.T. Priestley Medal, and it's presented each year, as you've heard, to the winner of the annual Literary Award. The very first recipient of the medal was Townsville-born Clem Christensen, who many would know as the founder of the leading Australian literary journal, Meanjin, and editor for more than 30 years. This year, we see the medal make its way to Victoria. We promise you, Sophie, it's in the mail. I know you've heard that before, albeit rather slowly through the snail mail services that we have in Australia. You will get that. If you don't, there's one sitting here that we could send by other means. And it's a very deserving award for you, Sophie. Thank you for presenting your excellence so well tonight. So you've seen the replica, and so all that's left for me is to extend warm congratulations to you on this prestigious award and wish you the best of luck for your future publications.
Thank you.
And let me say, if this is what nervous looks like, I can only imagine what you're like when you're super confident. That was marvelous. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bill. I'm thrilled. Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor. And look, for those of you who are gathered at James Cook, and I'm sure there's a beer or a wine in many people's hands, let's just raise our glasses under the stars and toast Sophie for her fantastic achievement.
Oh.
Thank you. Well done.
Thank you so much, Paul.
So you can imagine what's going on and bask in that.
A virtual one.
Yeah, excellent. And look, you know, the other thing is that this whole thing is being recorded and is going to be put up on the website. And what we found last year is that hundreds of people who couldn't make it at the time tuned in at a time of their choosing. And we literally had hundreds and hundreds, I think over a couple of thousand of downloads, people watching the ceremony and listening to the speeches and the commentary. So well done. Look, we have a few minutes now for a bit of a Q&A. So we have, for those online, there's a Q&A button there, and you can send in your questions. And I think that we might have Hannah in the background from the advancement team, or Erin, also available to funnel questions in to me through the computer here. So we've got until the hour, so we've got a few minutes for questions. So please, anyone out there in the audience, if you've got any questions for Sophie, whether you're in Townsville live or whether you're joining us virtually, please send them in and we can pose them, and I'll read them out for Sophie just as soon as they join us. So while we wait for people to send in their questions, Sophie, I'll get the ball rolling. You know, this is a classic question, and but it's always wonderful to hear. So, as a relatively new writer, what advice do you have for people who are, you know, aspiring writers? What are the kinds of things that you would say, given your experience, and to get to this stage, you know, so you know, such an elevated position in your career already? You know, what do you have? What can you share with other writers in terms of thoughts and advice?
I always kept a journal. I've had a journal since I was very, very young, and a journal is a place that gives you permission, practice, daily practice, and as little judgment as possible. Yes, I've got a funny sort of thing I say when I teach writing workshops. People laugh at it, but I say, just let the work, sometimes just let the work be dumb. I say, just take away all judgment, let the writing be awkward, let it fall far short, because all writing that falls far short will be a bridge to better writing. And you can't get to better writing unless you give yourself permission to write less than perfectly. In fact, the part of you that knows whether it's perfect or not shouldn't even be at play. Enjoy, practice. And, you know, I think sometimes less is more. Fewer minutes, 10 minutes even, 10 minutes a day is better than nothing for 3 weeks and then giving yourself a hard time about it. Daily practice. Read, of course. Oh, I can't hear you.
No, that's fine. I had muted
How did that
myself.
go?
But
Yeah.
actually, the lecture before we began with the award ceremony from Tony Birch, that was what he was stressing.
Mm.
He was asked basically, if I had to give up reading or writing, what would I give up? And he said, oh, it's easy. I'd give up writing, because for me, reading is so important and is so much part of me, and I get so much more out of it. Writing, I'm having to put back and give out, and sometimes it's really hard. So yeah, fantastic answer. Look, we're just waiting for more questions to come in. I had a supplementary for you, and I couldn't help ask this.
Yeah.
What was the inspiration for your main character? Like,
well,
where did he come from?
I don't want to tell you that he came from a Tom Waits song, partly a Tom Waits song, you know, because I mean, that's, I see these are like sparks. I imagine that Lawrence, or this character, resides somewhere in my unconscious, as if, and it's as if there are little sparks to the kindling. You know, I read a book by Cormac McCarthy where he gave himself an enormous amount of room to move, as if Cormac McCarthy wasn't concerned about who would like his characters or who he had to please, or whether there were rules and he had to abide by them. It was a book he wrote early in his career to give himself enormous liberty, as he should have. And I read this book. What's that?
Suttree? Was it Suttree?
No,
oh, okay.
no, it was.
I love that.
Is it Child of God?
Okay.
And I was very impressed and horrified by it at the same moment. It was frightening, and I thought, if Cormac gives himself this kind of permission, couldn't I do the same? And as soon as I sort of had that thought, not long afterwards, this character arrived on the page who needed to physically remove himself for periods of time, as I said before, and at the same time there were some lyrics to a Tom Waits song, something about the devil, keeping the devil down there, or I just remember these sorts of thoughts bubbling away. But of course, once the character takes a hold, those early sparks become quite irrelevant, and you can almost not join them to the story that takes hold. You know, I didn't know I would write a man that I would care for in that way. I didn't know about his innocence. I didn't know about his humour and how much he loved words, how much he would relish letters. All of those things build over a period of, well, weeks and months. So yes, I can be asked what the spark was, but they're only tiny little sparks to a fire that I sense is probably burning quite healthily back there somewhere. In that same part of me that doesn't know about prizes.
Yeah, and then there's the obvious follow-up around, how much of you is in there. Like the spark starts it, but then the author has to pump the oxygen in, right?
Yeah, it's a mix, I think. All that I can make of it is that it's a mix of aspects that reside more in the shadows, that aren't necessarily given voice. So they have a great deal of energy and much to say. and characters provide writers with the vehicles to say it. Yeah, and then it's also all the imagining that you've done in all the years, in all the years of your life without even realizing it. You know, there's a book, and anyone who's read the novel will know that there's a really important book in the story, and it's a collection of letters from some of the world's most famous painters, mostly 18th and 19th century European painters. And they're real letters that they wrote to each other. You know, I read from one in the reading, and I found that book 15 years ago. I found that book in America at a residency I did in a secondhand bookshop in New York. I know that sounds very, very glamorous, doesn't it? And exciting, and it was. So I picked, you know, there it was with its red cover, and I took it off the shelf and I thought, this is fantastic. These are letters between artists no longer with us. So I don't know when I find that book in a secondhand shelf, I know that I'm really taken by it, but I don't know what part it will play or what it means in some unconscious sort of a way. And you know, I put it on the shelf and it sits there for 15 years, and then out it comes one of the, you know, like a central motif of this novel, an incredibly life-giving. It's this character's whole community. His whole community is there on the pages, is there contained in these letters. And I suppose, this is only dawning on me now, that's the power of the written word. That's the power of the written word. And when one is deprived, as he is deprived, of so much else, then the written word, you know, pulses with life, becomes even more meaningful. I suppose that relates back to why books are more important now, you know, in these times. I'm talking about being locked down and isolated and being in a pandemic. Books, we don't need a stage, and yet we're on a stage. It's an incredible way to work. I feel blessed. I used to be an actor, and I'm really glad I'm not one anymore, because the books are a lot, you know, they work well in these times.
Thank you so much, Sophie. We're kind of coming to the end of our time. Unfortunately, there were no other questions, but that was a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And look, just to wrap up then, thank you, everybody. Thanks, Lee. Thanks, Bill. Thanks to everybody who's joined us tonight. It's been a great evening. I urge everybody to get out and have a read. Pick up Sophie's book. I think they'll have copies down there with Mary Hu's booksellers at JCU right now. So I'm sure you can pick some up. I'm hoping that I'm right here. And just a few closing words from me then. Look, the foundation has been around a long time, but we, like any other organization, fully depend on the goodwill and the participation of our members, our board members, you know, the people who volunteer their time to be on the judging panel, the munificence of James Cook University, without whose support, you know, we couldn't continue to exist, and to continue to recognize writers across Australia in all kinds of different genres, and to recognize not only their passion and their excellence, but really to promote people, to promote reading in all ages, to promote all kinds of different reading, stories by all kinds of different Australian voices, including traditional owners, which was a great part of what Tony Birch was talking about this morning. So if you never joined a literary foundation before, come onto our website, become a member. If you're a writer or you know, an unpublished writer, submit your work to our prize every year. Get involved in keeping Australian literature burning bright and making it relevant, like you were saying, Sophie, to today's issues, because there's no question that it is. Like, writing matters more than ever. Reading to me is the solution to all the world's problems. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Keep reading and go safely. Thank you very much. Goodbye, everyone.